Chapter 17. Questions and answers about debt. Jesus told us what is more important than anything else. You shall love your Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:37-39. Accordingly, God says there is one debt to which all our money and possessions must be unreservedly committed, yet which we can never retire. Owe nothing to anyone except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. Romans 13:8. Our indebtedness to God is to be treated as indebtedness to others, so that we keep both God and others in mind as we manage his money. In order to best fulfill that spiritual debt, we must free ourselves from the burdens that come with financial debt. What about borrowing to buy a house? Many financial counselors put home mortgages in a different category from other debts. One reason is that the loan is secured by the house's equity. If financial crises arise and the payments can't be made, the home can be sold, and the equity, which is the current sale value of the house minus the amount still owed on the mortgage, can be regained. A case can certainly be made for borrowing to buy a reasonably priced house instead of renting. Nancy and I did this many years ago, accelerating our payments and paying off the 30-year contract in 15 years. We never regretted borrowing the money or paying off the loan early, which greatly reduced the cost and positioned us well when 1 month after our final house payment, we experienced the loss of my job and a significant long-term decrease in monthly income. Unfortunately, as many aspiring homeowners end up with buying a house that's out of their price range, we all need shelter, but do we need a particular house in a certain neighborhood? We all need food, but do we need to eat out so often? We need clothes, but do we need designer labels? Look at the words of Jesus and Paul. Guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. Luke 12:15. I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. Philippians 4:11-12. Houses are often considered a primary exception of the stay out of debt rule, since most purchases are high depreciation items, including cars, clothes, and furniture. As soon as we buy such things, we typically cannot turn around and sell them without a significant loss. For instance, the moment you sign to buy a new car, you lose thousands of dollars in resale value that you cannot recoup. The steeper the depreciation, the greater the risk in a purchase, and the greater our presumption that we can absorb the loss it entails. For years, many people believe that houses always appreciate, that money put into a house was like money putting into the bank. Yet in recent years, as many have experienced firsthand, house values have plunged. God and his principles are certain, the economy is not. Who can know for sure which assets will appreciate? A reasonably priced house with an affordable payments may be a wise investment, but not always. We need to get the stars out of our eyes and think realistically before taking on extensive debt involving home ownership. The monthly payment for a home mortgage, including taxes and insurance, shouldn't be much more than buyers are willing to pay for rent. Most of the monthly mortgage payment goes for interest, but there are tax deductions that will reduce the net cost. Money paid for rent isn't tax deductible and doesn't build equity. On the other hand, homeowners spend far more on fixtures, decorations, upkeep, and improvements. One common formula for figuring out what's affordable is a purchase price that's 2.5 times or less the family gross annual income. But remember, there's no guarantee that you will have your job next year or that you'll be making as much money. Bottom line, borrowing for a home is something sometimes wise and sometimes not. If debt seems the best or a necessary choice, go slowly and prayerfully. Get objective financial counsel from good stewards, Proverbs 15:22. Some real estate agents give helpful counsel, but many won't advise you objectively since they are rewarded if you overspend. Husbands and wives should be sure they're in total agreement, or their marriage will pay the price. Should we have and use credit cards? As of 2010, the average American credit card holder owed over $8,000 to credit card companies. And while those with extreme debt pull that average up, it's equally true that those who pay off their cards in full every month pull it down. The average college student owes about $20,000 in student loans by graduation, some 3 times that much, plus another $3,000 in credit card debt on non-essentials. Credit cards facilitate impulse buying, typically for unnecessary and self-indulgent purchases. When using credit, consumers buy more, buy what they don't need, and pay more for it. Like being handed the controls of a deadly weapon with a hair trigger, many people are propelled by their credit cards into irresistible debt that entails exorbitant interest, often 15 to 20% annually. Even when it's under 10%, it adds up quickly. The person with a $2,000 balance at 19.5% interest, he can pay just $75, but doesn't realize that the first $32.50 of that $75 is interest. He goes right on charging sale items and digging an even deeper hole. If you carry a $7,000 balance on an 18% credit card and pay the 2% minimum payment, each month you'll end up paying more than $20,000 for that $7,000. All those things you bought at half price, they may cost you 3 times what you think they did. Some people use credit cards for the convenience, paying off the full amount owed on every statement, so they don't ever pay interest cost. We do this ourselves, and in 25 years, we have never paid any interest. This approach has advantages, but it also has drawbacks. Citibank calculates that consumer using a credit card will buy 26% more than he would if he were carrying cash, even if he pays all off without interest charges. Here are some simple rules. Never use your credit cards for anything except budgeted purchases. Pay your balance in full every month. The first month you have a credit card bill you cannot pay in full, perform plastic surgery. Cut the card in half and don't get another one. Even if you pay the full amount when due and avoid interest charges, if it's psychologically easier for you to lay down a credit card than to part with cash, you shouldn't own a credit card. If you carry a credit card and say, I won't use it except for emergencies, when I would have used cash anyway, you may minimize the drawbacks, but keep an eye on your spending. The ancient book of Proverbs applies directly to our use of credit cards. A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. A simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. Proverbs 22:3. When it comes to credit cards, be wise, not foolish. Should we pay off all debts before giving money to God? Responsibility to God is not negated by our choices to become indebted to men. When we rob God to pay men, we rob ourselves of God's blessing. No wonder we don't have enough when we're holding on to what God called us to give to Him. It's a vicious cycle, and it takes obedient faith to break out of it. Even if I've come into debt legitimately, isn't my first debt to God, since He says the first fruits belong to Him and not to me? For Christians today, first fruits are the first portion of what we've earned. On the first day of each week, we should each put aside a portion of the money you have earned. Don't wait. 1 Corinthians 16:2. If we're faithful in our giving to God, only then can we look up to Him for help in finding the resources to pay others. Jesus says in Luke 6:38 that with the measure we give to God, it will be given back to us. Now, this doesn't mean generous givers never experience business losses, but it does mean that God will sustain faithful givers even in the midst of financial difficulty. And the more serious our financial problems, the more critical it is that we do what God ensures will result in His provision. Give. God will not eliminate the consequences of our unwise decisions. If by giving to God we can no longer afford to make payments on a loan, then we need to liquidate our assets, take losses where we must, and pay off that debt. But we should never rob God, not for any reason, and certainly not to compensate for past or present self-indulgence. How can we get out of debt? Scripture declares that whether we borrow for good reason or bad, it's our responsibility to pay it back as soon as possible. To not repay a debt is to join ranks with the wicked. The wicked borrow and never repay, but the godly are generous givers. Psalm 37:21. Bankruptcy, though lawful, is normally not a moral option. I believe God is honored when people of integrity come out of bankruptcy proceedings with the legal right not to pay back a dime. but as a matter of conscience, dedicate themselves to a full repayment as soon as they can. If you are in debt, 2 questions are relevant. How did you get into debt? And how can you get out? If you've gotten into debt unwisely, you should do more than get out of debt. You should also recognize that you've made wrong choices and commit yourself not to repeat them. Debt isn't the main problem. It's a symptom of a more basic problem: greed, impulsiveness, the lack of discipline, sins we must confess to God. Here are 8 steps I recommend to get out of debt. 1. Repent. Acknowledge that you've taken your cues from the world, not God. Change your mind and actions regarding money, things, needs, wants, giving, saving, spending, and debt. 2. Immediately give God the first fruits. When we give to God the first and best of our income, we say in effect to Him, I recognize your ownership and trust you to bless my obedience. It's self-contradictory to seek God's blessing on your finances while putting yourself under His curse by withholding the tithe and even the free will offering. He directs you to give. 3. Incur no new debts. Operate on this principle. If I can't afford it now, it isn't God's will now. 4. Systematically eliminate existing debts. Prepare a realistic budget. Make a specific plan to get out of debt. Seek wise financial counsel. Liquidate unnecessary assets. It won't happen overnight, but with a good plan and determination, you can and will get out of debt. 5. Perform plastic surgery on your credit cards. If the card makes spending easier or you can't pay the balance in full each month, cut it up. 6. Stop rationalizing your debt habit. Houses and cars are the strongest temptations for some, whereas furniture, clothing, or electronic equipment tempts others. Recognize your weakness and don't let it master you. When it comes to houses, remember this: the carpenter of Nazareth is making the perfect home for you in heaven. John 14:2-3. It's not here and now, it's then and there. Consider that God may want you to use His money here and now to send building materials ahead. Matthew 6:19-21. 7. List your debts and, if necessary, contact your creditors. Establish a schedule that's workable within your budget to repay your creditors. By comparing the different interest rates on your debts, prioritize your debt reduction, then pay off most quickly those with the highest interest. If your debt is beyond your ability to pay at prescribed levels, explain your plan of repayment to your creditors. Normally they will welcome your plan because they've often faced with bankruptcies in which they receive little or nothing. In some areas, you can contact the Consumer Credit Counseling Service, which offers debt counseling at no cost. But if they advise you to stop giving to God's kingdom until you're out of debt, remember, robbing God isn't a solution. It's a major part of the problem. 8. If you've done everything else and there still isn't enough money, consider new ways to increase your income. I've been assuming that you are doing all you can to work for a living and earn a wage. If you aren't, obviously that's where you should start. Liquidate unnecessary assets and use the funds to reduce debt. If you are already working full-time, more work isn't a long-term solution. Still, a second job or household business may be a temporary necessity to reverse the consequences of past decisions. Be patient. It may have taken you years, even decades, to accumulate debt. It won't disappear overnight. Remember, seek wise counsel. We get into financial trouble by acting on our own. We should expect to get out of it by doing the same. By following these guidelines, you'll be well on your way out of bondage. You'll also start to experience the freedom to respond generously to needs and eternal investment opportunities. Your return on those investments will be the joy of giving as well as God's grace and blessings that come with it.